Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our latest Pods of War Warcast, where we discussing another aspect of how we interact with military history. It's something which may be of value and interest to those listening in. I'm joined today, as ever, by Howard Fuller and Spencer Jones. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you?
Good afternoon.
I'm absolutely fantastic, John.
Good. I see you're still going with your branding of Ohio State University there. I'm not sure that's necessarily a great thing, but we'll have words about that.
University is so rich. Wouldn't it be great if I had an endorsement for all of this? Every sip of coffee is like $5.
I'm sponsored by the Hedgehog Society today, as you can see.
Mine's Sherwood Forest, but it's not really, the gaming's a great deal, is it really? So
Rob
anyway,
the rich and give to the poor.
Very good. I like the cut of your jib there. Okay, the subject today that we've discussed is about the use of games in teaching when we're delivering material and stuff about military history, war studies, and trying to get people to understand it and get an insight into it. We have used over many years a variety of games, simulations, negotiation games as well, in order to try and highlight some particular aspects of military history or history generally, about how decisions are made, the interactions and so on between different sides. So what we thought we would do today is to discuss some of the elements of that, some of the examples, and to what extent we think people derive something from it. Does that sound like a good topic? Going to go with that?
Yep. Sure.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to kick off because I'm the oldest, only a little bit older than Howard, but nonetheless, despite what it looks like, but I am. So the first that I've been a teacher, it goes back, good God, 30 years. And 30 years ago, man and boy, the first game that I used in teaching, and it was in those days it was about innovative teaching methods and all that kind of stuff. What can you do to be different? And on the Introduction to History course that we used to run, we did particular case studies, and we'd show about the historical debates and so forth. And I did one on the Bomber Offensive, arguments for and against, and so on. And it was quite timely because when I started, it was when the statue to Arthur Harris was unveiled in London. And that caused a bit of controversy and so on. So it kind of built into that a little bit, but it's a really good, juicy topic for people to debate. One of the things that I did on one of the sessions was I got them to play a game which highlighted some of the aspects of the Bomber Offensive. And the way it was very crude, it's just a few bits of dice and cardboard and made it up. And basically it was a grid with 4 columns in, as I recall, and numbered, starting with a low number and then sort of going forward and forward the further you got into bombing successfully in Germany. And the Allied player had to choose particular strategies about how they were going to bomb or what they were going to bomb and to devote their resources to it. And they could go for area bombing, oil, I gave this thing, area bombing, oil, transportation, maybe, industries or something like that. And area bombing was the easiest one to bomb, so you get big hits, you could make some progress on that, but you didn't have much effect. It didn't cause a great deal. There were kind of tipping points at certain stages they bombed away, and the other targets had more effect, but were much more difficult to hit. And the German team who were opposing them had to decide where to invest their resources, what to defend, what kind of defences to go for. They could go for technology, or they could go for anti-aircraft guns, or they could go for planes and so on, and they had to decide where to deploy them and place them. And the two teams had to play, it was only about 45 minutes, something like that, and by the time we've explained how the game works to a bunch of students who, most of them have never played a game like that before, because these were history students, it wasn't specifically war studies always, many of whom would look perplexed and baffled by the whole concept of doing this. It didn't take long to play out, but there was a kind of a breaking point, a built-in breaking point. If you managed to get so far into bombing things, you had multiplier effects. So the further you got down the column, the more profound your effects would be. but whether you had the resources to make it stick and so on. So it's a resource management game, but hopefully it highlighted some of the issues that, where you develop your strategy. And the thing that always tended to happen was that the allied players would lose their nerve. They'd keep bombing away, and then about 4 or 5 attempts in, their bombing campaign wasn't going very well. They were suffering appalling casualties. The German players were laughing at them and throwing insults across the room at them and so on. And they'd shift strategy. They'd have a plan at the start. We're going to bomb oil. Oil's a thing. That's what we're going to go with. So they start bombing oil. Of course, you don't get anywhere in the early stage of the bombing campaign trying to hit anything specific. So they all go hideously wrong. They're not getting anywhere, or they're making very, very slow progress. And then they'd change their minds and they'd go for something else. And then they'd say, area bombing looks easy. Let's switch to that. So they get more effect, or what appears to be more progress, but with fewer effects. And later versions I did of this, I included something which was along the lines of moral negativity points or something like that. So the more you bomb cities, the higher the future generations would look back on it and castigate you for having bombed civilians. So you had to be careful. It was kind of if you did it too much and you killed too many people, you'd have a knock-on effect. So that was the first one that I did. I ran it for about 7 or 8 years, something like that. And it also generated my first nickname at the university amongst colleagues and staff, which was Bomber Buckley, which they thought was hysterically funny, which I had to live with for a very long time. So it kind of that was the first kind of thing that I did in use of games. So I think there was something to be gained. It illustrated certain points, perhaps. Don't know. What were your first experiences of using them, or thoughts?
Well, age before beauty, so I'll let Howard share his thoughts first.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to preface this as briefly as I can by saying that the idea of using war games in higher education as part of a history class or a war studies class was something that I was introduced to myself as an undergraduate at Ohio State. There's another endorsement, by the way. And it was a honors pro seminar class in military history with Wick Murray and Stan Carl. It was co-taught. And we would meet in, I think it was Stan Carl's office once a week for a seminar session, and they would have us play a war game. And as we found with a lot of students at Wolverhampton, most students, most undergraduates at least, never played like a war game in their lives. And I was one of them. I had done like D&D or Traveller, things like that when I was in high school or younger. But a proper war game, tabletop miniatures, or something like Squad Leader, I'd never done. Never quite introduced to it. Maybe I just didn't circulate in the right crowd. We didn't have that crowd, I don't think, in small town Illinois.
The wrong crowd.
At Ohio State, I got it. And the first game that we were introduced to was Squad Leader. And there it was laid on a table.
So, what an introduction.
Howard, just a minute here. You'd never played a war game before you went to university?
Not like that. Not.
Is that what you're saying?
I've done role playing. I did fantasy stuff, maybe some sci-fi, things like that. We've done military board games, but actually painting miniatures and doing the rest of it, not quite. Not like that. Well, I mean, I was about 19 or 20, I guess. So there I was playing Squad Leader. I'd never played Squad Leader, and it was us, wet-nosed sophomores, second-year undergraduates. Versus, and he brought in a couple grad students, like PhD students, and they were running the game and playing the Germans. And I remember one game in particular where we had to we were like an American squad. We had to get up this hill and storm these buildings. And as you say, John, it quickly became, once students learned the basic rules and were getting into the game, people's nerve began to crash very quickly. Mine didn't. I've often found when I game, I'm much more reckless in
steel nerve. That's what I like to hear.
I wouldn't say it's not so much steel nerve, John, as just being reckless. Because to me, I knew I was playing a game and I could probably take risks that I could never take in real life. So at one point, I did charge across open ground against a German machine gun nest, and they started laughing and calling me Sergeant York. I remember that. And I had to make a couple of rolls on a 20-sided dice, and the odds were like 1 in 20. And I got lucky, right? We've gamed together, and we know how sometimes I can get stupidly lucky and stupidly unlucky. And in that instance, I was stupidly lucky, and I made it across the field. And eventually we won the game and drove the Germans out. And we were like, yeah, you know. And I was doing gaming with mates as an undergraduate at the same time, late night, you know, beer-ridden sessions of Risk and all the rest of it. Started doing war game designing. So when I was at Wolverhampton, the idea of introducing war games into the classes was great, and I'd seen what you were doing already. So it was like, John's cool, all right. and I knew what gaming could be as an educational tool and all the rest. So I think I took over War in the Modern World, the first year undergraduate core module. At the time, it was coded WR1002. And we did, you know, the template you'd set up.
All our yesterdays here, goodness.
had the campaign. So we had a campaign that was running. That was when the module will still run over the year. So it was a spring and an autumn and a spring session. And during the autumn, we hit first year undergraduates from the get-go with campaigns. And they could either do Agincourt, I think I introduced Trafalgar, and then it was Fall of France 1940 were the scenarios. And they split up into teams. They would issue orders based on their research. The game masters would basically, you know, judge it out and then give them, well, this is what's happened as a result of what you've done. How are you going to react? And then they would write like after-action reports and analyses afterwards. It worked. It was a good team exercise for them. It was kind of a game. So they got to play with counterfactual notions with history and see, well, you know, what was plausible in this campaign and what was completely implausible. So one year I remember quite distinctly the French team was obsessed with using balloons during the Trafalgar campaign to invade Britain. They were like, hey, we read it somewhere that Napoleon was considering using balloons, and that's what we want. We're going to build, you know, 5,000 hot air balloons, and we're going to float them across the English Channel. And so I remember saying, are you sure you want to do this? You know, there are plenty of factors that are at stake here that you may not be considering. And they're like, no, that's what we're going to do. So, of course, I think the first thing that happened was the weather turned bad and all the balloons drifted out into the North Sea or something. They were never seen again. So they learned the hard way, John, you know, and but at the same time,
well, that method, that way of doing it that we did goes back even further, because I mean Spencer might remember this from years before, even before you arrived in sunny Wolverhampton. We started with that. We did Agincourt. I remember that was the first one we did on that module. I can't remember what the other ones were, but we definitely did one Agincourt, and they only took 3 or 4 moves. And the students would have to type it out, because this was before email was in general use. They'd have to write out they'd have some research materials, one be the French, one be the English, and they'd have to decide what they were going to do, what their objectives were, and all that kind of stuff. But there was only 3 or 4 moves. It was mainly kind of political, strategic, really, and it's to get them to read the sources and talk about some of the problems and issues they confronted. But I do remember that a couple of times it got quite entertaining. On one occasion, one team, because there were about 3 or 4 of these things running at the same time, because lots of students, about 5 or each team was about 5 students on, so you had 2 teams, so you had about 40 students. About 4 of these games going at the same time in the older days, and they on one occasion they handed in their orders, but they put the wrong name on, and so I was responding to one team with the other another campaign set of orders, which bred some confusion. But the most entertaining one was that they were in those days they had to write them on the computers on campus, because nobody had laptops, and you know you didn't have and one set of students were writing their orders, and the opposition was watching which computer they'd been using. And then when they'd written their orders, they'd go away. The second team, the opposition, would go to that same computer and they could find the orders that the first team had written. And so,
Nice.
so they were observing
That's
some
right.
kind of major security breach until the first team realised what had happened and set a trap for them and gave them false orders about what they were going to do. So there was espionage and counter-espionage. So then they got suspicious
John,
and didn't trust any of the orders they were seeing, and they were all very
all
careful about
fair
it.
in love and war, right? So all fair in love and war.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I remember the Agincourt. That was the first one we did on that. Spence, what was your first use of games in this kind of way?
So I've got a slightly different background in games. So my first educational game I was exposed to was a really old 8-bit game that was called Decision in the Desert, and it was by the great American game designer Sid Meier, who go on.
Are
to
we
make
talking computers here? Is this computer
We're
stuff
talking
already?
Computers.
Oh no!
So that was and I had a game. It was on cassette. That's how old it was. It's on an 8-bit computer. It's called Decision in the Desert, and I absolutely loved this game. There was also, even before that, I've just remembered, there was a game, and this, if you're into computer gaming, and particularly computer strategy gaming, you might know this one. It's considered an absolute classic of the genre, and it was simply called Eastern Front, and in which you controlled, it was Barbarossa, essentially. Brilliantly designed game, a masterpiece of AI design. You can actually play it for free online now. If you just Google Eastern Front 8-bit game, I think it came out in about 83. Even long before I could play it, but absolutely fascinating game, really, really cleverly done, brilliantly done. So my background to that was computer games. I played quite a few of those games growing up, and obviously they got more and more advanced, more and more sophisticated. In terms of tabletop, mainly I was playing fantasy stuff, especially Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 from Games Workshop. That was my bag. Little bit of historical stuff. So I played American Civil War Fire and Fury, which was a really great sort of fast-play system. Brigade level, it always looked gorgeous. You had beautiful units, little marker. It was very, very, very visual. And one or two other historical games as well, DBA and things like that may bring back fond memories for you, John. In terms of using them as an educational tool, the first one I did at Wolverhampton was actually, and I'm very sad how, because you've edited me out of history here. You were mentioning the games that you ran on War in the Modern World, and you couldn't remember the last one. I was thinking, it was my game. I ran an American Civil War scenario that was based
Antietam,
around...
wasn't it?
The Antietam, the Confederate invasion into Maryland, and does Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation and all this. And so I ran that. So I came to it, and I suppose the system was already well developed, but it was, as the previous system, it was a free-form game. It wasn't map or counter-based. I have to say, if you looked under the bonnet of how this game ran, it was extremely loose. But what I know the way I ran it was I really tried to encourage the students. The more research you do, the more options you're going to find. Try and keep it historical, because inevitably students would go herring off, as you've just said, Howard, about Napoleon invades by balloon. With the Civil War one, occasionally you get students would have fixated on a piece of kit. I remember one year the students found out something about a shipment of very accurate marksman rifles that had arrived in the Confederacy, and they said, we're going to equip all these snipers and they're going to assassinate people. And I was saying, well, hold on a minute. Another time the Union got really excited about the idea of armoured trains with cannons on the back, because again they'd seen some fringe reference to
who doesn't get excited by armoured trains?
Oh, who indeed? But as Winston Churchill reminds us, they look great, but they're basically useless in war. So it's fun to play with, and it was a 3-turn game, free form. Tried to encourage them to get into it. And what I found, and I don't know if you found this, was obviously student groups come in different shapes and sizes. Some are very driven, some really got into it, some just struggled to engage with it. In general, I found the students did engage with it, and the level they engaged with it varied, of course. Some got really hooked on tactical minutiae, but others understood the bigger picture and so on. And one thing I always found was when they started, because it was 3 sets of orders and they get 3 reports in return, the first order might be a bit hesitant, and so I'd always try and encourage them a bit by giving them quite a vivid situation report back. and so they tend to increase and their own efforts from that. It was a sort of encouragement. The more you put in, the more you get out. By the end, I often had the students say to me, "Oh, well, I wish we could have played 4 or 5 more turns," because everybody was always hesitant at the start. Nobody wanted to make a mistake, and I think that's partially because for a lot of them it was completely new to them. This type of war game was completely new. A lot of uncertainty. It wasn't like they could look at a board and say, "Okay, we've got this, they've got that." They actually had to go away and say, "Well, what is available?" I thought they worked really well, and they were. Some of the most rewarding material, I'm not sure if you had the same experience with your groups, was the discussions afterwards, where you'd sit down once you'd finished and you'd say, "Okay, explain to each other what you were trying to do." And sometimes the groups go, "Oh, we thought you were trying to do that," or "Oh, if we'd known." And that lifting the fog of war was really interesting. And I try and turn that into a discussion then about, well, imagine you're actually in a real war. And the fog of war isn't lifted until a historian comes along and says, "Well, this, and this happened. How does that make us assess command?" But I'm not sure if your experience was the same with your groups.
Yes, I mean, in my case it was, and that there was often a fixation, and you always get different dynamics of groups and things. And the problem, and we found this with one of the later games that we might discuss a bit later, that we've used, is that students tend to be democratic. And they want to make a collective decision, and it doesn't work in this instance. You've got to have a chain of command, and somebody's ultimately got to make the final call about what you're going to do. And so many groups be racked with indecision and not wanting to be seen to take ownership and drive the early stages of one of these campaigns. And so they'd faff about, they say, "Well, we'll do a bit of research on that, we'll find out about that," and they want more information. They always want more information. Far more than they would historically have had, but they don't want to move until they've got all the information. I think that maybe is a product of some other games they might have played. If they have played computer games, often you get far more information. I believe far more information you would historically. You can get the information that misleads you a little bit into thinking what kind of information you would have. The other issue is that you'd quite often get the equipment kids who would come in, and they know all about tanks, or they know all about the longbow in great detail. They've seen Henry V or something. "Oh yes, the longbow is the thing that's going to win it all," and they get fixated on just the technical explanations, like your armoured train story, that this is the way, or the balloons and so on. And one of the things that you get out, or I think we got out of doing those games, was that it would encourage people to think that it's only one tiny part of an overall solution about how wars are fought, how decisions are made, and what it is you've got to do. How do you match resources to your objectives? And getting fixated, a bit like Adolf Hitler, on his tanks and his kit and everything. He was fascinated by technology and so on. You get drawn to it, which is why the Third Reich it all went appallingly badly in the end, or one of the reasons anyway. So in a military sense, so getting them to think about that. There are not just those solutions. There are different ways of solving problems in campaigns. I think that was drawn out of it. That technology is only a tiny part of it, and the dynamics of the group, where you get somebody who knew all about it, sometimes could drive them into bizarre solutions, such as balloons over the channel in, I don't know, 1805.
War games are good that way. I mean, they are a form of seminar exercise in a way. You get to sort of lecture, and you have a seminar that's more interactive, try to get people to think about what they've been reading and advance their own thoughts and watch their thoughts sort of impact against other people's ideas and the rest of it. And yeah, the wargamings I found are very good in bringing out things that they're not normally fixated upon, like weapons and tactics. And as you say, things like logistics, leadership, morale, and the sort of terror of leadership, the sort of process of decision making and the sort of burden of command and the loneliness of command that could lead to infighting and paranoia and all these sort of perhaps more intangible factors, which are very real in war, but are perhaps require skill to sort of bring out in two-dimensional text, in writing in classic history. So these kinds of exercises are very good for adding another dimension. It adds a z-axis to all of this, and yeah, then you have the students go back and analyze it. Then you have them go back to their readings and say, oh, so now I get the idea of the sort of nuances of leadership and whatever the Antietam campaign, and how, it wasn't just about who had the bigger army or who had the better weapons, but the bad decision making or intangible factors that went into the chain of command, for example, or other intangible factors like, say, the weather, or disease, or Napoleon had a bad tummy on June the 18th, 1815. Who's to say how these factors all contributed to how history played out that way? War games can be, if they're done well, they can be very good in adding an extra layer of understanding.
You say that about the kind of tummy upsets and things. I remember I was at External for a PhD last year, and the guy who did the work, he argued that Alan Cunningham made a Horlicks in the Western Desert in 1941 because he was suffering from nicotine withdrawal symptoms. He was so heavily addicted to nicotine that it was causing him health problems. So they took the nicotine away just as he was about to make a series of key command decisions at the start of the campaign. And he started to lose the plot. He was so addicted that he had loads of withdrawal symptoms that caused him to make a number of mistakes. So factoring that into a game situation where suddenly, I don't know, you take away the team's coffee or something just as it's about to go into action, or you starve them or something, just to try and reflect upon what the conditions might have been. Paddy Griffiths used to do that, didn't he, when he used to do games and things? He'd do kind of bizarre things like shout at them or throw things at them, or have to hide under a table whilst they're making the decisions and stuff like that to simulate certain things.
I have to share an anecdote, and I appreciate it's a little bit off the piece, but I played in a Paddy Griffith war game that was based on being in the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, and he had a set of basically miniatures desks, the kind you get in a school, little small tables, but you were surrounded on three sides by cardboard, and you had these vision slits cut into them. Supposedly you're in the armoured conning tower of your battleship, and I can't remember exactly how many people there. It was quite a few people. It was in a hall, so maybe there was sort of 12 people, I can't remember, representing the battle line, and the guy at the front would put up flags, because you've got no radio communication. He put up flags, and you had to try and decipher what the flags meant. And occasionally, just because Paddy Griffith was like that, the late great Paddy Griffith, occasionally he'd say, "You're under fire," and he'd come running round and he'd shake your table to show that your ship was supposedly taking hits or being straddled and things like this. I mean, it was completely bizarre, but it was good fun, and it did sort of capture something about, you're peering through a vision slit. Okay, so of course it's gamey and silly, and you're looking at these flags. And it used to really, I was there, I was squinting away, trying to decipher what this flag message meant, and then the flags would change, and I'd think, well, what the hell are we supposed to do? And it did I think it achieved what it was trying to achieve, which was to show you it's difficult to control a fleet. And of course the fact you're in battle and your ship's on fire or it's taking hits and smoke from your guns. So I think that this idea of to bring it back to what we were discussing, one of the great advantages of the war games we've done at Wolverhampton is, I think the fog of war hangs really thickly over the students, and it really does, as you say, Howard. The terrible responsibility of making a decision when you don't know everything, and perhaps because they are groups, and of course they might lose status amongst their peers and so on if they make a bad call. We had students who, there were still jokes being made about them. Do you remember the chap who got, this is going forward a bit, we'll talk about the Naval War Games perhaps in a moment, but Naval War Game, and he managed to get the Tirpitz into action, and it got sunk. Oh, yes. And he was still being teased as the man who lost the Tirpitz the day he graduated. So
I do remember that, yes.
So with all this fog of war and the burden of responsibility, it does teach the students something about the loneliness of command, the weight that the commanders have to bear.
That's an important element. The main area, I think, in terms of what we describe as perhaps a classic strategy game or war game that we've used over the years, is in the Dreadnought to Enterprise module that we run, which is the third year module about maritime warfare and naval strategies and so on, and the interactions between. And we set them part of the assessment. They do real work in terms of an exam, but they also do a game where they have to do come up with kind of a strategic overview, an operational set of plans and orders, and some tactical solutions, and they have to refight or fight in a similar kind of environment a key campaign or battle from the First or Second World War. And that, again, it's team-based, and they have to do their research, they submit plans, and we look at the plans. And then they play the game out over an evening of about 4 hours and put them in separate rooms. So it's double blind, so the Germans from 1917 in one room, the British from 1917 in another room, and we're in the middle room with the biscuits and coffee and the overview of what's going on. And we send them orders, and they have to send us orders about what they're going to do. And then they interact. There's some very rudimentary rules in terms of engagements and things, but it's more about the decision-making process and seeing how their plans play out. And the key thing that always comes out about is the speed of decision-making, that they often don't want to make decisions. Again, that's in the early days that we used to run those. I don't know if you encountered this. They refused to make a decision. They'd just hesitate and they'd agonise about everything. And in later iterations, we persuade them that you've got to have a chain of command for exactly kind of reason about decision making. Somebody's got to take ownership and responsibility. The others have got to brief in terms of what they're supposed to be doing, looking at the orders. One would be good on that have done a research on tactics or something, or ranges of aircraft or something like that. But somebody ultimately has to make decisions, and if you don't have that, it really exposes the problems in making things happen in campaigns. Somebody's got to take ownership, and the others have got to work with them, even if at the time inside their heads are thinking, this is a bad idea. There's a point at which the debate has got to stop, or somebody's got to take ownership. We did. Spencer, you ran on one in 1917, didn't you? That was the kind of the brief on that one.
Yes. So the 1917 one was. It was difficult. It was a difficult game in some ways for either side to win a decisive battle, but that's trying to make a point about the nature of surface warfare in the First World War. And we had some really interesting decisions, and we must have run so at least 10 of these. I do have a list of them, and all the results somewhere. And what I found, and you might remember
you're
this,
the stato of the department.
Stato of this. What you might remember, John, is generally the Germans would take the initiative in this game. The British could be reactive; they could see what's going to happen, and the Germans came up with some quite innovative and quite daring, in many cases, plans and ways to try and isolate bits of the British fleet or score a propaganda coup. And over the years, we saw quite a few German plans coming together quite well. One thing that always struck me is quite often there'd be a crisis point in the German plan where, okay, you've achieved more, you're in a position where you could do some serious damage here, but there's a level of risk too. And you're not sure if the Grand Fleet, the Royal Navy, is going to pounce on you. And the number of times we saw teams at that crisis point, and the tension in the room was palpable.
Yeah.
You could have cut it with a knife. It was that tense. And I would say only about 50% of the time did they make the correct decision. I remember in particular, there'd be the debate. You'd see the students look at each other and they'd be like, what do we do? Have we achieved our objectives? One thing that was interesting too about the Germans was the best German teams made a very clear statement of what they were setting out to achieve. And if they felt they'd achieved it, they left. They would withdraw. Whereas other German teams, a bit open-ended, they get lured in. Other times German teams would say, well, if we see an opportunity, we'll seize it. But then an opportunity would appear and they go, oh, what do we do? What do we do? There was one really weird game, I don't know if you remember this, John, where the Royal Navy just didn't do anything. The Germans turned up on the British coast and started smashing seaside towns and shooting up trawlers and wrecking coastal defence ships and things. And the Grand Fleet kept saying, it's a feint. Yes. It's a feint. We're not going to react. It's a feint. And in the end, I remember we were so... It only ever happened once. We were so stunned by it. I don't know if you remember this. We had the King George V, sent a direct command to the fleet saying, defend the coastline. and force them to do something. But that it was interesting. It was similarly with the British. Sometimes they'd be in a position where they were chasing the Germans, or they got a position where they thought they could really clobber the Germans, and it was how far do you push this advantage? And I know we had at least one occasion where the Grand Fleet just went crashing into minefields outside Heligoland Bight, and it was a very ugly incident.
Despite all the warnings and sage-like advice,
Yes.
that maybe this isn't such a good idea, and maybe there's a reason why they didn't do it during the First World War.
Well, I mean, the beauty of that game scenario as it's run every year, and is that a lot of the students, again, that we get, at least the undergraduates, have been weaned on video games, and a lot of the video games make it all too easy to give people a god's eye view or a bird's eye view of the battlefield, so they can kind of see everything that's going on, and it's just sort of a mathematical equation they have to work out. How do I deploy my resources in the most efficient, logical manner? Maybe they're playing by themselves as well against a computer AI or against other people, but it's very simplified and very straightforward, which of course we might discuss later. Brings us to one of the classic critiques of video games, the sort of limitations of it. What the Dreadnought to Enterprise game does for a lot of these students for the first time in their young lives is introduce them to double blind. Because when you have a double blind scenario and you don't see your enemy and you don't know what they're doing, you don't even you can't get feedback directly as such. It's coming through refs, or it's coming through garbled reports or sightings and things like this. You take away the idea that they don't even know who's got the initiative in the game at all, right? So we often say that a lot of the games, and perhaps success in war, is about trying to gain the strategic initiative, to put your enemy on the defensive and call the shots and feel like you're directing things, which is good for your morale and undermines the morale of your opponent. But in a double blind scenario, you're not even quite sure whether you've got the initiative or not. Maybe you feel like you do, and you're going to foolishly charge into a minefield or something like that. Or maybe you actually have an enormous preponderance of force, but you assume the worst because you don't know what the worst is. You don't know, and your head starts playing tricks with you. And it turns out, as is often the case in real life throughout military history, you're your own worst enemy. As such, so that kind of scenario right there is very good for doing that, and it is fun, yes, to watch these students encounter that kind of experience for the first time, and they're under pressure. They don't want to seem like fools. The Germans love the idea of maybe smashing the Grand Fleet, or the Japanese at Coral Sea or something love the idea of smashing the American fleet or something like that, and but the best laid plans and all the rest of it. So that kind of wargaming can bring out that very simple fact that, again, as Spence was saying, the fog of war, the blindness, the heavy oppressive weight on decision making of what you don't know, and the way that your mind can start playing tricks on you, or maybe the chain of command is finally tested. The people you work with, the people you're relying upon, you will finally know how valuable their input is going to be or not when push comes to shove in the crucial moment.
There's always a key moment, I find, that this has become increasingly an issue, where there's a realisation that they can't get information about what's going on, and the communications issue is a real problem. And despite the fact, and this is more the case, well, no, it's the 1942 scenario that we do, but in the 1917 games that we've run, the commanders on both sides are always saying, where's our bit of fleet? Where's this force? Because they have to stay as a group. They're a command group on the flagship of the main fleet. They're not allowed to disperse, and so they're a staff command group on the flagship. So they send off bits of their fleet to various parts of the North Sea, and they say, well, what's happened to them? Where are they now? I said, well, they've gone where you've told them to. Well, get them to tell us. Signal them, and if you do that, you're going to send a radio message which could be intercepted. It could give your position away. And despite the fact that radio security is or telegraph security, whatever, is an issue, a real problem in both the First and Second World War, the number of times teams would engage in micromanaging everything by sending messages all over the place, giving their position away. And it doesn't matter what you say. And that, I think, is indicative of a world in which we have communication links all the time. Shutting yourself off the net or the web, is kind of radical step. I leave my mobile phone at home, no one can contact me. That's complete anathema to most people now. But of course, in those situations, it's a weakness. If you're trying to gather all that information all the time and you need repeated reassurance about it, you expose yourself to so many difficulties and problems. The other thing that I think that comes out of those games, and this is one which has come out time and time again, it does demonstrate big strategic operational problems that cannot be overcome. For Star Trek fans, the Kobayashi Maru scenario, the unwinnable, the scenario you cannot win. And we found this with the 1942 Eastern Solomons kind of Santa Cruz kind of campaign. There's carrier battles in the South Pacific, August, September, thereabouts 1942. And we have slightly different scenarios. But I think we've done it 12, 13 times maybe over the years, Spencer. And I don't think we've ever had an American win. We've had a couple of some draws, but generally speaking, the Japanese come off better because it's a really difficult scenario for the Americans to get a decisive victory. It's almost impossible. For a whole variety of reasons, they're forced to support a landing force at Guadalcanal. So they're tied, their position is given away, and so the initiative is effectively surrendered to the Japanese. I know the Japanese are responding to what the Americans have done in a lot of cases, but the Americans have to fulfill that responsibility of covering the landing forces at Guadalcanal for a period of time. And that exact problem is the one which confronted Jack Fletcher, the commander of the US task force at that time, who was pilloried. The Marines really had a go at him because where's the US Navy? And they kept disappearing. But the reason Fletcher kept disappearing was because if he stayed there, he gave his position away and surrendered the initiative to the Japanese, and his carriers could get mugged. And there were engagements where this did happen, and they recognised the Japanese had tactical superiority. But that kind of problem confronts American commanders in that game, which is why they keep losing or they can't secure a win. Now, of course, winning the game or winning the battle is not the be-all and end-all at all of what we're trying to achieve here. So it doesn't reflect at all in grades or how we assess this and so on. It's just a small factor in it. But getting them to recognise that issue is a real point of that particular game. And the number of times in the debrief afterwards, the American basically, other than doing the Jim Kirk thing of reprogramming the game, you have to accept that this is something you can't do. And you have to accept that there are real forces at play here which prevent you from getting a decisive victory, tactical or even operational victory. You've got to manage a situation and achieve your objective. Your objectives are not to get the Japanese fleet, it's to protect the landing force of Guadalcanal and not get blown up yourself. That's a difficult one to get through. But it does come out of it. There was you remember this one, Spencer. We had one team who, I don't know why they did this, American team, but they parked their aircraft carrier off Guadalcanal. They had a couple of carriers, and they sat there. It was night time, and we kept giving them warnings that the Japanese surface fleet was appearing, or that there's rumours that it's heading towards them. And they were just like startled rabbits, weren't they? They couldn't make a decision. They're utterly paralysed. And we had almost like a real-time scenario. We're feeding them. You see star shells overhead. Explosions start to spout around your fleet. And they're all just, what have we done? What have we done?
What have we done? I remember
exactly.
That so well. Yes.
So,
and the Admiral in charge
that was just a classic example. It wasn't because they were incapable. Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't anything to do with ability or academic ability. They just didn't take the decision. And that was one of the early ones where, trying to reinforce that you have to take command decisions and put somebody in charge is a key element of this.
There's also the other side, and that's that, as we said, the Americans have never won this scenario. There's been some which have been quite close. I think it speaks a little bit about the Americans get big. They can never quite decide what they want to do. Sometimes the Japanese haven't done much either. We've had one or two games where I know where just the fleets have never got anywhere near each other. They've just poodled around. But one that sticks in my mind is almost the exact opposite of where the Americans got obliterated in Iron Bottom Sound. And this was the Japanese team. And if you remember, I won't name him just in case he's tuning in. But we had a very, very good undergraduate student who was in charge of the Japanese team. And I remember the way he'd set up the team was like the bridge of the Enterprise, because people had got assigned roles. There was this sort of calming Japanese instrumental music playing in the background, and I can see him now. He was sat with his arms folded in front of the map while his team buzzed around him and did various things, and he was just the model of calm. And we tried a few times to try and discombobulate him with reports or incidents, and he just wasn't phased. And one of my enduring memories is going in, and we thought we were going to really throw him with this, and I can't exactly remember what the piece of information we gave him, but he looked at it and he asked one of his the subordinates, because they'd obviously arranged this, what have you got on this? And oh well, no, there's nothing to worry about here. That doesn't confirm what we've already got. And I remember I could see him now. He gave him the piece of paper back and said, "We'll take no action on that." And I thought, damn it, we're supposed to be freaked out.
I know exactly who you're talking about, and he was absolutely super, and so his team. And
yes,
the
his
key
team were
thing that they
excellent,
did, they identified their particular skill sets. Was somebody who was taking notes and keeping it all organised. They're obviously a good organiser. Somebody who's really good on stats and a really good factual knowledge about ranges and all that kind of thing. Their particular penchant for that. They've been deployed to this. So as soon as the commander said, "What's the range of this?" It's this. They can get there in this amount of time. This information was just perfectly to hand. And that's the way you should do it. I can't even remember. They did win the game, didn't they?
They did. Yeah, they absolutely put the Americans to the sword in the end.
As I recall, wasn't that the year the American team took it as some kind of party central, and they dressed up, dancing around with music.
They were dressed up. Yes, it was in the Navy. The theme was, if you recall, village peoples in the Navy.
It was, yeah.
Quite a moment.
Which isn't what I have to hasten to add. That's not what we're trying to achieve with this. They still played the game out, and they did take it seriously. But there was this kind of culture of teamwork and so on that they created. I'm not sure how successful it was. I don't think they had their eye on the prize throughout that particular evening. Whereas the Japanese team were just spot on. But that's it. I mean, identifying a key command decision, how you make decisions, using the resources, the best people assigned to the best kind of roles and things, and somebody who stands back from the minutiae of the game and sees the big picture, which interestingly is how Montgomery functioned. He never allowed himself to get bogged down with minutiae. You wouldn't deal with paper briefings or anything like that. He would only respond to oral discussions, verbal discussions, what he wanted to know. He didn't get involved in running things, he just saw the big picture. And that's a key role with these games. And those who manage to do that tend to be more successful in what they're trying to achieve, I think, overall.
John, one more thing.
One of the other things sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was just going to say, one of the things I might want to point out is that we used to run a second-year undergraduate module called Virtual Warriors, the Evolution of Wargaming. And one of the purposes of that module was to simply introduce war studies, history undergraduates to different types of gaming. So, as we say, a lot of them were born and bred on video games, first-person shooters, maybe some PC strategy games, things like that. So we took the opportunity of introducing them to things like board games, counter operational campaign strategy games, also tabletop miniatures, as a way of saying, well, even in terms of wargaming itself, each type of system of gaming, including role-playing, using double-blind, things like that, can bring out aspects of gaming, but also their subject matter, study of their subject matter, historical subject matter, military history, warfare, campaign, battles, why things happen the way they did, better than others. So video games are superior in many respects, but then again, there's a lot to be said for a hexagonal grid game that can bring things out. And that module was pretty good in exposing students to something that a lot of them had never seen before. They take it for granted, perhaps, and force them to think, perhaps a bit more reflectively about video games.
You started off with chess and Risk and so on. You did a lot of
Yeah,
things
we
like
started off with some
chess and
classic
Risk, and
board
you take them
games,
through
and
the
then
various types through.
we moved them to for the hex. We moved into Phil Saban's Hell's Gate, which was fast and quick, and we ran some tabletop miniatures. And then every semester, as a feature of that module, we would round them up in a coach and take them to a war game convention. So it was either Warfare at Reading when the module ran in the autumn, or Salute in London when the module ran in the spring semester. And again, it was a eye-popping, eye-opening experience for a lot of these students. And I always said, well, if they come out of it and they go back to their video games and they're thinking a bit differently, then we've succeeded in that respect, at least. That there are other ways of approaching a historical topic methodologically, if you will, that can bring out different layers, levels of analytical thinking.
I remember on that particular module, I used to do the background to the hex games. You just didn't on that because, unlike you two, my first encounters with war games were figure games and things when I was about 10 or something, with Airfix kits and Airfix rules and stuff like that, Donald Featherton kind of stuff, I suppose. But the first strategy games, and I forced you two to have a go at this on occasion, and I talked about this in the session on Virtual Warriors, was SPI big games like War in Europe, which is when I started thinking about the bigger pictures of games. And in the early 80s when I was playing that, I just remember the look of horror on students' faces when I was talking about a game that would probably take about 9 months to a year to complete, 180 hours of playing time, 46 square feet of map, and weekly turns which would take forever, production spirals and all this kind of thing. And you could just see the look of horror on the faces. You'd have a physical game that you try to engage with and set it, but that counts as the culture of it. But that's where I started on the kind of the bigger strategy games, for all their flaws and weaknesses and things.
There is something to be said for psychological attrition with that much logistical management involved, because a lot of PC strategy games, for example, are very sellable because the computer programming, the AI, does a lot of the logistics for you. It simplifies the decision making in the extreme, and that kind of cheapens the experience in many ways. It does sort of take away as a psychological attrition of managing. Okay, you want to manage a campaign on this kind of scale. Here we go. This is going to take you a long time. It's very detailed. The scope is huge. You can't afford any chink in your armor, or someone could exploit that, and the whole thing could come down like a house of cards. And
there's that famous game, isn't there? Another SPI monster game from the early 80s, which was Campaign in North Africa, I think it was called, which had 240 hours of playing time, and it was. In the end, it was considered by the gurus that I never played it. I don't think they've ever seen it, an actual game being played with it. It's supposed to be completely unplayable because of the logistical management of it. It's a logistics game in essence. So you had to account for feeding, providing fuel and water and things for all your forces fighting in North Africa in such excruciating detail that you had to have teams of accountants in order to make everything add up. And if you tried to do something, you didn't have all of that, your army just starved or stopped. And there is that, we've discussed this before, about there's a balance between simulation and game playability. If it's too much of a simulation, and you have most of your team or staff filling in dockets and forms and passing bits of paper around, as indeed most military operation, that is a lot of what it's about, that takes a lot of the essence of the command decision, and students won't engage with that. But if you make it too much like a game, and it's too abstract, or it's too gamey, and you're trying to find ways to win the game rather than learn something from it, you go to the other extreme. And what we have to do with teaching games is try and get the balance between the two. You're trying to get some points across. It's not about the rules. A number of times, in a lot of these games, these double-blind ones in particular, where students who have some kind of wargaming background say, "What rules are you using?" And we just say, "Oh no, it's a closely guarded secret, that." But basically, it's free Kriegspiel. We're making it up, and it's based on, and there are all sorts of flaws and problems with that approach. For the purposes of what we're trying to do in the maritime games in particular, we have an idea of outcomes. We know the kind of things that happen. There is an element of chance, but basically, we're managing something which they're getting something out of. So it's not a game as such. It's somewhere between a simulation and a game because we're trying to get something across. Though I should say, we try to make it look pretty. We've always used miniatures, big maps, and little ships and things and aeroplanes flying around on maps which they can move around, and which they never keep up with. They always get that wrong. They're marking a ship which is about 200 miles away, further away from where it was supposed to be, but they've just stopped marking it. Keeping up that kind of control is important. But the experience is an important element of it. Because
one thing I'd say is just how positive the reaction has always been to the war games. Even when the students sometimes curse their defeats or their ill fortune or so on. One of the I mentioned it earlier on in the podcast. One of the most rewarding aspects is the wash up, when suddenly we reveal what's happened. They're in the they're in the command room. They can see all the miniatures. They can see what's actually happening, and they talk to each other, and they really share this. And I know that certainly the naval war game we ran for many years pre-COVID was considered a bit of a highlight of the entire third year. People used to really look forward to it. It was something that was big. We used to get people from sometimes would come and watch a war game and things like that. That's how involved they were with it. And I think that intersection between wargaming simulation and education is really interesting, really valuable. The students, for the most part, work really hard to prepare themselves for the game. A lot of reading, prepare their plans and so on. This wasn't just it was fun. It was absolutely a fun way to learn, but it was also a chance to do some really serious research around the topic, which, in fairness, we've spent a lot of time talking about how the game itself worked, and of course that's interesting, but we'd be doing the students a disservice if we didn't also mention the amount of research they did prior to the game, because that was an important part of it too. They had to produce I think it was a 4,000 word situation brief. So it was a substantial piece of work, and they did put a lot of time and effort into it. And it's I think it was really valuable, and obviously it got disrupted by COVID, but hopefully we'll get to bring it back.
Yeah, but you know what, Spence? I think you're bringing out a good point here, which is that not every university that offers history, military history, or war studies, I put in quotes, not every university will dabble in war gaming. Maybe they think it's too close to sort of a warmongering fetish, just playing with tanks and being obsessed with tactics and weapons, that kind of thing. Maybe it's because the staff themselves are not gamers. They don't have no gaming experience whatsoever. It doesn't occur to them to do these kinds of simulations. Surely wargaming only takes place in military academies. Sure, they game at the Naval War College or Sandhurst or something like that, but we're not going to do that here. And who would do it? I'm pretty proud of the fact that places like Ohio State, Kings, but also Wolverhampton, very strong in this particular pedagogical type exercise, which, as we've been saying, is very useful. Not everyone does this kind of thing, but we have been doing it.
I mean, we do some games as well on field trips that we've run, but perhaps to discuss kind of the field trip idea on another occasion about what people get out of that and why it's useful, whatever. The final thing that I think is worth discussing is where I tend to use as well on the MA. I don't know if you guys have done something like this. A kind of a cabinet decision-making game where it's more like a role play rather than a game as such. They don't have particular objectives, but they have aims which are set out for them at the start of the negotiations. And each person takes on a particular role, and they sit around the table and have to negotiate and debate a particular idea. And they're supposed to come to a solution or come to an agreed outcome, but reflective of their particular personality or character that they're playing. And they're supposed to do some research. Most of them do. And they come to... so for some of the things, we do one which is about the decision by the German government in 1917 to embrace unrestricted submarine warfare. In February 1917, the meeting Castle Pless and so on, and so somebody plays the Kaiser, somebody's Ludendorff and Hindenburg and so on, and von Holzendorf. And they're supposed to take on particular roles and so forth. which tends to work. If they engage with it and get something out, and they have to debate and try and force through. The ones who do more research tend to get their points across, but it is still a gaming situation where they've got objectives, and at the end of it, they have to decide: have I fulfilled the objective that's set for them? And we do it in a master's level where Martin Alexander used to come in and do a session on the French cabinet's decision to accept the Vichy surrender terms. In 1940, in summer of 1940, they all played different roles and things and so on. And we also did one of the British cabinet decision in May 1940 to carry on the war or not carry on the war, or try and negotiate the whole kind of the thing that Gary Oldman did in the Darkest Hour film, though with a bit more historical credibility, I think, in our discussions really. And so people like Halifax and things. So again, objective-led debates and discussions or role play are a key part of getting people to think about why decisions are made. And some people get really into that. I'm not saying they're dressing up or anything, but nonetheless, they come with an attitude. And somebody came to play the 1917 discussion and turned up with a big moustache and so on, and a pickelhaube and things, in order to get the impression of being the Kaiser and so forth. And so those kind of elements add a kind of a different dimension to it as well. Which are not, in a sense, traditional war games, but it's a gaming situation where you're trying to get people to debate and role play something. So it's kind of along the same lines. They have objectives. So I think there's something useful for that by using things like that as well.
Well, there's
Right.
always that debate.
Go on.
I was just going to say, there's always that debate, particularly, say, with the First World War, about responsibility. So you could take something like Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers and say, well, who's responsible for the First World War at all? Is it, if you examine more players and sort of equal detail, would you come to the conclusion that it wasn't necessarily Germany's fault, or was it everybody's fault as such, and therefore nobody's fault? Which I think that sort of thesis found a lot of opposition. People were saying, well, what do you mean? I mean, where are you actually going with this kind of analysis? But yeah, wargaming and role-playing is it's a very useful tool for bringing out, in many respects, that same kind of perennial question, not just in terms of the battlefield, as you say, but also, high-end statecraft and diplomacy.
It's the interaction between the two, which is interesting. And so, again, what you were saying before about attitudes to what games are for, and the idea that it is just people shoveling tanks or aircraft around a map and something and rolling dice, and it's just a game. What you're actually trying to get out of it is why. Why is that happening the way that it is? What are the pressures? What are the strategic drivers behind key decisions? And then how does that translate onto the battlefield in terms of how things are unfolding? Which
wargaming is
technology and kit
wargaming is in many respects wargaming is the forensics of military history as such. It's a way of examining things ex post facto, lay it down on the slab and slice it open and start working with it. That can, you can discover new things.
Absolutely. Right. Our time is up. We've discussed games and their interaction, war games, their interaction with the teaching of military history and war studies. We'll put some pictures and things alongside what we've been talking about to illustrate some things we're talking about. And we need to start thinking about the strategy games for this coming autumn, because I believe we'll be back in action on the seas of 1917 or the South Pacific of 1942. And depending on numbers, we might even have a PQ-16/PQ-17 Arctic convoy game as well for students to play out. So much to think about in the future. So thank you, gentlemen, and I shall see you all again very soon.